All right, my name is James McBride, and we're going to take a look at, real quickly, in general, what is this course about? Now, obviously, the first chapter is going to explain that very well, but I wanted to give you a little bit of information on why the course is the way it is. This course is mainly for those that are going into IT, but of course, it's beneficial for anybody who's going to work someday and anybody that wants to learn more about their operating system. So I've got listed on the screen here in this little presentation, the most used worldwide to the least used worldwide of the top operating systems, and a little explanation on what that is. So at the top, I've got Linux. Now, Linux is not the most used desktop operating system. Windows is, definitely. And often when we look at operating systems, that's what people think of. They think of what's running on my desktop, right? That's the old school. Now we've got mobile, and there is a lot more stuff happening in mobile and a lot more computing happening in mobile that many people in the industry just don't take it into account. They don't want to go there because things are changing. So what I mean here is that Linux is used on servers a lot. Most of the stuff that we do on the internet is coming off of a Linux server. Now, Windows servers are very popular, and we'll get to that and how they're used just real briefly. But by far, when you talk about, hey, who's using Linux? Not really for the desktop. If you look at per capita, it's way at the bottom. It's well below Mac OS. There's tons of different versions, or I should say different distros that you can get and use for Linux, which is fun. But the standard person is just not, they're not doing that. So let's talk about all of computing, right? That's what you see on the screen. This is all of computing, anything we're using computers for. So Linux becomes the top one for that. It's used on, again, most of the internet servers you're hitting are, the bare bones underneath are Linux, is Linux. And then you've got mobile, right? Android is based off of Linux. That's what it's based off of. And so when something kind of becomes so popular, then they start to, within the media, right? Not necessarily within the industry, but within the media, they start to treat it different. And on a lot of people's minds, they don't even know that Android is based on Linux. Right? That was lost years ago because it's become so big. When it's written about as Android, not a Linux variant. So it is a Linux variant. So you can, whatever commands way down low that you're going to issue are going to be Linux commands. And then, of course, the desktop, which, again, I would put that way down here. It's way down there. Windows is, predominantly, we spend a ton of time on Windows because when you talk about standard desktop equipment, Windows 10 by far owns that, right? It's like 80% of the entire market. And that's kind of divided up between Windows 10 and Windows 7 on the desktop market and moving to 11. But if we're going to take all of Windows, then yes, we have to consider their servers. And when you're talking about a server inside a company that's being used for what the company needs locally, Windows servers are predominant. They are probably third or fourth within this category, like out there, right? What if you're going to use Amazon AWS? It's you have Linux servers running that. If I was going to do a hosting service, not a hosting service, if I was going to get a hosting service, I would have the option: do you want to run this on Linux or do you want to run it on Windows? So Windows is out there, and if you don't believe me, just go out on Microsoft and just take a look at Azure, Microsoft Azure, and they're a big player in the same thing that these Linux servers are in. But no, they're not as popular out there, but it's a huge portion. And so on desktop, yeah, by far Windows is really, you're going to spend a lot of time in it because on a desktop support, that's what you're going to be doing is Windows 10 mostly. But when you start to take all of computing into the situation, this is where Windows ends up. And then you've got iOS and iPad OS, which is really based off of Mac OS. So Mac OS is a Unix variant. It really is. A lot of books don't even talk about that. They talk about Unix separately, like Sun Solaris stuff, Oracle Solaris. Sorry, Sun is older. And they talk about those versions of Unix, which Linux kind of sprang from. but they don't talk about the fact that, again, Mac OS, iOS, iPad OS is Unix. That's all Unix-based stuff, all Unix commands below. So this is an offshoot of Mac OS. And why it sits here is because, again, in mobile, the mobile is just exploding. And people just don't think of it like they should. And you're going into, hopefully, this industry, and you need to think of it like you should. If you went into, say, a large company and you sat down at a meeting of the higher ups, they're going to be sitting there with their iPad. That's what they're going to have, not usually an Android tablet. So when you talk about tablets, yeah, there are Android tablets and they're heavily used, but how they're used is different. And what I mean by that is you're not going to go in and support those tablets as much as you might think. And there's some reasons that we won't get into here for that. Mainly security is part of that. And so you walk into this meeting and there they are, and they've all got their iPads and they're typing notes and writing out stuff or whatever they're doing, or they're doing that on their phone. And then when they need to, they go back to their desktop, and maybe their desktop is a Windows desktop, or maybe they got a Windows notebook, or they've got a Mac notebook. So when you look at worldwide, this Mac OS is only like, what is it, 12% of the entire world, or Windows is just massive, right, as far as the desktop goes. And then Linux, as far as the desktop goes, is just minuscule and tiny. But when you look at, okay, well, overall devices that people are doing computing on, then you have to consider mobile, right? So if you're talking about phones, then Android and iOS are massive operating systems that people are using on a daily basis for business use. And what I mean by business is work use, whatever the business happens to be. And then iPads are a huge portion of that. And usually what limits the use of something like an iPad is the fact that the legacy stuff we use, basically Word and Excel, and the different systems that organizations use. And why I say systems with quotes is because all these places use their own data systems, and they're based on standards that are out there, but they're tied into Excel and Word and those big names. And they have all these processes that are all tied up in that. And so they need to be running that on whatever they built it on, right? They haven't transitioned to the new stuff. And that's usually Windows, right? And so there's a lot of times where somebody's like, okay, well, here I'm taking notes on my iPad, but I don't have that feature-rich application that I could have, but I don't because nobody's made it. And so now I go back to my desktop to deal with that, or my notebook to deal with that issue. So these are the major operating systems that you deal with. We will look at mobile operating systems. So we will look at Android, we will look at iOS, iPad OS, but within the material, they haven't gotten to the point where they've switched. And again, the whole industry is kind of like that. If you went out and talked to somebody in the industry and said, what operating system do you use the most? They would think PC. They would think notebook. They would think those standard devices. They wouldn't think of, for instance, everybody at EA using Microsoft Teams, and I don't need to use Microsoft Teams on my desktop. I can just use my phone and accessing that data. Or this Canvas, right? I grade most of my stuff off of my iPad because it's actually easier to grade off of the iPad or the phone than it is the actual desktop. And so there's this disconnect. And so we try to cover all of it, but the book does focus more on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, because that's where the traditional focus has always been. And you'll be doing those things over and over again. And again, I just want to reiterate that those of you that are taking remote and you may not have access to Mac OS, iOS, iPad OS, or Android, those assignments, if there's one of you need to step through and do these things within the operating system, there will also be the alternate assignment. And you do one or the other. And the alternate will be based on, well, I'm learning about this, but I don't actually have to have it installed to get this to function. Where Linux we can install in your Windows, Windows you can install in your Linux. And yeah, again, you can do that with Mac OS, but it's technically not totally legal to do, and it's a little more difficult. Definitely worth checking out because it's kind of cool. All right, so that's just a little bit about this course and generally what we're going to be covering and going through every single week. And we will talk to you later, and make sure that if you have any questions that you ask. See ya.